dig ourselves deeper and deeper into debt. Mr. Speaker, the reports that we receive every time from the government every year don't show the accurate financial performance or the accurate financial position of government books because of all these, the manner in which the accounting systems or the accounting methods are adopted by the government. Therefore, I think as a matter of urgency, we should move and require that the Treasury adopts or the government adopts the accrual basis of accounting, because then that gives us an accurate position of where we are as far as our finances are concerned. Now, when we have these contracts or agreements where we are incurring or we are contracting external debt, and the works take a long time before they start, in the meantime, the debt cannot be dispersed because the counterpart funds has not been made available, we start incurring penalties if a contract has been awarded, and we get ourselves into problems or we incur costs which we shouldn't be incurring in the first place because of our inefficiencies. Case in point where I come from in Bonchari, the Ahero Isibania Road. Can I have a minute, please, Mr. Speaker?
Well, your contribution is good. I add you 1 minute.
Thank you, sir. The Ahero Isibania Road is a road which is financed by the African Development Bank, and it serves quite a big range of many counties, many constituencies. Now, one of the things is that because the government doesn't have the money as it's part of this component to the contract, the works are stalled. But what happens when the works stall? The contractor keeps sending us an invoice and then it keeps building up, so that we find ourselves getting into a worse situation. So that we can be able to make the monies available from the time we negotiate for these contracts, we negotiate for these loans, we're in a better position. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Honorable Lilian Gogo, Rangwe.
Thank you so much, Honorable Speaker. I rise also to give my contribution on the report on the Consolidated Fund Service Expenditures for these supplementary estimates for 2022-2023. And I actually rise to support this report by the Select Committee on Public Debts and Privatization. The committee has done a good job, Honorable Speaker. I've gone through the report, and I want to appreciate the work the committee has done, especially given the situation where we find ourselves as a nation that is enslaved into real serious debt. We live on borrowed life, we live on borrowed time, we live on borrowed money, Honorable Speaker. The largest expenditure under the Consolidated Fund, Honorable Speaker, the largest expenditure under the Consolidated Fund services are interest and principal payments of the Kenya's public stock of debt that has grown because of the sustained physical debts. Of course, we get debts, fiscal debts, we get debts, we get more, and we go for more. There are people who are willing to give us money, and then we just keep picking and picking money without thinking of the interest that would be accruing from this borrowing. And then we also don't look at how we are going to pay. So we get debts, and after getting debts, we don't know how we are going to pay. And even if we pay, we don't pay regularly. The Consolidated Fund, Honorable Speaker, have remained relatively unchecked, and they have received minimal oversight. And you realize, Honorable Speaker, that the work of Parliament, the main role of Parliament is oversight. Other than representation, in making laws, we are supposed to oversight the working of government. So I want to appreciate the work of this committee for coming up strong, and I also want to appreciate Parliament for coming up with this particular committee, because it was not there in the 12th Parliament. And with the work of this committee, Honorable Speaker, the way they've come strong with this particular I've seen the chair has done a very good fast forward, but he's not just stopped at that. He's also come up with very, very serious recommendations to mitigate what is going on, especially in terms of minimizing our public debt. The stock of public debt that is we owe as a country is running to almost 10 trillion. And this requires about 1.3 trillion to service, honestly. When we run to a budget of about 4 trillion, and we are using about 1.3 trillion to service just the debts that we take, then we really have to question ourselves if we are financially smart as a country. And when you come to find out, Honorable Speaker, this huge debt, what are the physical structures that we are able to see on the ground for the debt that we owe? Where is this money? Our education sector is reeling in unpaid debt. We can't afford basic things like food, Honorable Speaker, and we are saying we owe 9.3 trillion. I want to ask the nation called Kenya, this money which you owe as a nation, where is this money? If it is found in your pocket, may you be cursed, because our children are not able to go to school as you keep money that is in way of debt, and we are supposed to pay 1.3 trillion to service the debt, and we can't do our basic responsibility as a nation. It is a shame. I thank you.
Very well. The Honorable Dege cannot be seen in his usual place. So then let's have Honorable Abdul Haro Mandera. Not there, then we have Honorable Daniel Manduku, MP Nyaribari Masaba.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me the opportunity to make a contribution to this important report. Mr. Speaker, it's only in Kenya where we spend 1.55 trillion on account of the CFS costs. If you look at this critically, Mr. Speaker, they are more than 100% of our current expenditure and more than 2.5 times our development expenditure. Mr. Speaker, under these circumstances, this country cannot develop. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, with the debt ceiling of about 10 trillion and currently running more than 9 trillion in debt and growing, this country faces a huge task in ensuring that we get enough or adequate resources for development. Mr. Speaker, national debt, when borrowed carelessly, as is clearly evident, becomes a generational curse. The National Treasury is now using orthodox and unorthodox methods in trying to raise this ceiling by purporting to advise this House that future borrowing should be pegged as a percentage of GDP. And they'll tell you that in Japan and in the US, the ratio to GDP and debt is more than 100%. But they'll not tell you that those countries are owed billions of dollars by developing nations. They will also not tell you that those countries borrow and lend in their currencies, and so they are exempt, or they are not affected by currency fluctuations. And so, Mr. Speaker, reading through this report, which is prepared by our committee, I want to emphasize the need for legislation. One, to ensure that there's an annual loans finance bill. This should be done with the utmost care and expedited as soon as possible. Furthermore, there's need to amend the Public Finance Management Act of 2012 for 3 reasons. One, to establish the sinking fund. Two, to ring-fence the counterpart funding, where we have funding from international lenders like the World Bank. And three, and most importantly, to sanction officers who do not adhere to lay down procedures in committing this country to borrowing and hence forcing this country to pay commitment fee where there's no money that has been drawn. Mr. Speaker, I think this committee also should have its scope expanded to include other obligations like the pending bills. And the chair of the Finance Committee put it very well. It is time that the pending bills are brought before this committee so that they can be put as part of the obligations that we must meet as a country. Secondly, we are aware that this country has got a lot of unpaid awards by the courts. Kenya, as a country, has billions of shillings that it has not paid as court awards. And this should also be captured by this committee because they form part and parcel of the obligations. Mr. Chair, Mr. Speaker, we need to look at Kenya Airways critically. We have been told that Kenya Airways is a very strategic parastatal, a very strategic investment, and I think the problem with Kenya Airways is that government is inside it. I'm one of the people who believe that government cannot do business. And so the involvement of this government in Kenya Airways should be relooked at. We were told that telecom was very strategic and it could not be privatized. But see what happened when we liberalized the telecom sector. It is time that we either restructure Kenya Airways, we sell it to a strategic investor, or we just close it down. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, allow me to make a contribution on the retired pensioners. A simple calculation will tell you that the youngest existing retired pensioner should be about 115 years, having retired in 1963 at the age of 55. Mr. Speaker, I think the National Treasury should be serious with this matter.
Please bring out that mathematics in 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very good in maths, you can be sure about that. Having retired in 1963 at the age of 55, 60 years later puts the youngest pensioner at 115 years. Looking at the Guinness Book of Records, Mr. Speaker, there are not many people who live beyond 100 years. But according to our records, this year, we are paying a whopping 150 billion shillings to retired pensioners. Mr. Speaker, I think this House needs to recommend that these pensioners are physically identified using our facilities abroad, including our High Commission in London. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Very well. Honorable Joseph McLap, Baringo North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to declare that I'm a member of this committee. And Mr. Speaker, this country is living on a borrowed time. Unless we implement the recommendations of the Committee on Public Debt. Mr. Speaker, we are operating between fiction and reality. The fiction in Kenya is that the dollar, the exchange rate is 126 as per today. But when you go to a bureau outside here, it retails at 130 something. Madam Speaker, Mr. Speaker, sorry, where the agreements that were done in this country was done in USD. And it was not fixed then that this loan shall remain using this particular rate at that time that was borrowed. So as the dollar rises, the loan becomes very expensive. And therefore we agree that if you have to borrow loan on using agreements of US dollar, then we must fix it that it shall remain in this particular rate to the end. And this is why we are saying we either negotiate using our currency in Kenya or fix the dollar or any other foreign currency at that rate at that time when the loan is being borrowed. Mr. Speaker, The worst scenario is this country should know that we are paying our colonial masters who retired long time ago. And one of them that I saw in the report was born in 1924. Mr. Speaker, our teachers, our civil servants who retire wait for more than 3 years or even beyond to receive their pension. For the foreigners, the foreigners who colonized this country who are retired are promptly being paid every month through an agent called Crown Agent. And this is why this committee recommends, and we may amend the Pension Act so that the employers in Kenya keep on, for example, teachers, they notify the teacher 1 year before retirement that you will be due in retire in June. And yet they don't prepare the dues of the teacher until the teacher retires and keeps on waiting until almost to death to get his pension through a lot of cartels within that pension department. There is need, Mr. Speaker, to streamline the pensions department through this regulation, these proposals that we've made, so that the pensioners of this country will be able to get their dues on prompt, not the colonial masters. And I agree with my colleagues that list of foreigners need to be scrutinized, because we are paying pension to persons who are living to close to 120 years. Mr. Speaker, the reality is this. The last parliament raised the ceiling to around 10 billion. Mr. Speaker, I'm telling you the practical situation. As per 30th December 2022, our debt stock was reported at 9.15 trillion. And for us to complete this particular financial year, we require an additional 1.36 trillion. What does that tell you, Mr. Speaker? We shall surpass our debt limit, and therefore we are unable to actually finance our programs. And Mr. Speaker, I will borrow 1 minute. Mr. Speaker, there is a monster called pending bills. What do you know, Mr. Speaker? Pending bills are created by people in government, cartels in government, so that they use Article 223 of the Constitution to pay for projects and programs where budget was not actually provided for. And in the end, they will be able to get kickbacks by paying using Article 223 of the Constitution. Mr. Speaker.
Very well. I think your point is well made. Let's hear from Honorable Thuku Kwenya, the MP Kinango.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity to contribute to this maiden report by our committee that is on debt and privatization. And from the onset, Mr. Speaker, I must convey my gratitude to the previous House for, in its wisdom, deciding that this Parliament is going to have this committee to look into the issue of debt and privatization, which is a matter that needs to be given priority. Mr. Speaker,
Order. Honorable McLeod, you are getting seasoned. Just do what should be done. Proceed, Kwenya.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From the onset, I just want to support this report. It is a report that is well thought out, a report that maybe if the people who are supposed to implement see the wisdom in it, will maybe address issues that would cure the issue of CFS expenditure to the tune whereby it's going to be manageable. And Mr. Speaker, from what we gather, the CFS expenditures are just, they're well stipulated. It's just about pensions, public debt payment, President and Commissioner's salaries and all. And from the foregoing, Mr. Speaker, we get that the biggest share of CFS spending is coming from public debt. And this is becoming an issue not just in Kenya but in Africa. But I want to confine myself within my jurisdiction because we need to address this issue before it gets out of hand. Having a public debt that is consuming 8% of all the CFA's expenditure is a cause for alarm. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, when we engaged a few agencies like the Office of the Auditor General, we were able to gather that maybe what has been reported is not what is the total debt in this country. And we realized there's also a lot of money that is committed or paid in terms of commitment fee of monies that have been availed as debt that has not been absorbed. And that being the case, Mr. Speaker, in this report, there is a serious recommendation that within 2 weeks, the National Treasury affords or files a report with us just to apprise this House as to the tune of public debt. Mr. Speaker, looking at our budget system, because that is where all these emanates, the issue of debt emanates from our budgeting system. These, Mr. Speaker, from the budget formulation to budget making, budget appropriation, budget financing, that is where we incur serious debt, because we have always put the cart before the horse. And I think it's just about time, like my brother, the MP for Molo, has said, that we look into the issue of the budget cycle, so that then we don't put the cart before the horse, whereby now we must think, where are we going to get the funding before we start to imagine that we're going to appropriate anything. Because if at all we're going to go the route of appropriation and then finance bill, so that then we can commit the taxes that needs to be collected by this country, and then think of the deficit, which is now the issue that we are addressing as the committee of public debt, then that's where we're missing it. Because we'll be always on a journey of wanton borrowing. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, this committee has also recommended that even as finance committee formulate or bring to this House finance bill for every year's expenditure, and the Appropriation Act is passed, we also pass or bring into this House a public debt financing bill every financial year, capping the amount of money that can be borrowed within one financial year. This issue of leaving an open-end borrowing whereby we cap an amount that Treasury can borrow at will is something that we must scrutinize, and as a committee and as a House adopt a solution whereby we must have a public debt financing act for every financial year. And from that, Mr. Speaker, because of time, I wish just to pray that this report be adopted as it is. And as a committee, I know we're going to follow through to see that if this report is going
the Honorable Beatrice Elachi, MP Dagoretti North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the onset, I want to thank you and to thank the committee. It was one of those committees I really tried to be part of the members, but I think I was told I don't deserve. But anyway, having said that, Mr. Speaker, I want to just say that having worked into and being privileged to work within the Senate, within government, within counties, and looking at now where our country is, Mr. Speaker, the report comes when the country indeed, and globally, we are facing our own economic crisis. And Mr. Speaker, Parliament, and we need to thank the 12th Parliament for establishing the committee. We have all the powers to ensure that this country can be stopped to go into a crisis that the executive would wish it goes to, and even Parliament can decide now to stop and to start managing our debt and to start seeing where do we get solutions in terms of paying our debts. In this report, Mr. Speaker, you find that Treasury, ever since this new constitution, yet they are mandated to ensure the budget you bring into Parliament must be an itemized budget, a budget that speaks to itself. To date, they have never attempted, they have never tried, they have left the country, and that is why we are in this crisis, because we leave so many gaps in where people just take advantage of the country, and you find ourselves in crisis. And the worst is when, within the executive, the ministers or the cabinet secretaries then would just go and sign for a loan. You are not even using the loan, you have not even been given the loan, but now we are servicing the loan. So why can't we have a recommendation that says, any loan that we have never spent, never received the money, it is time we send the loan back. We would rather have a painful situation where you pay, but pay it, let it go. Because we are not using it, we've not started spending it, but already you have started paying the principal on the same date. So, Mr. Speaker, when you look at that, and you realize Kenya, we collect revenue, put together, then we spend again. And so it finds itself in a very, very dicey situation where, as much as you'll speak to Treasury, I think the problem and the culture that we are in is in Treasury. And the other thing is that within Treasury, anything called pending bill, indeed we must penalize people, Mr. Speaker. Even in CDF, how can you have pending bills in CDF? I mean, people are saying, I still have this, and yet it was a budget that was done knowing very well there was money for that budget. What happened to the money? And so it's because we don't have a mechanism of sometimes penalizing some of these things. Because you cannot tell me in this country, Mr. Speaker, you know very well, you cannot budget and initiate a project when you know there is no money. It is either a PPP program, or government has money to spend to do, or a county has money to spend to do the project. And so we have to come back and ask ourselves, those who decide now when they are officers, you change a whole budget and you take the monies that were meant for this project to this, it is time we come up with mechanisms. And that is why this committee was formed. Put up mechanisms to ensure we also penalize officers in government who just decide. And that penalty, if you are being forced from the executive side, from the top, then it is important to come to Parliament and say, and let it be approved so that we don't end up having the same questions that we are asking. Mr. Speaker, I read the other day the Auditor General said something very interesting, that we now need to assist those who have taken money to invest in our country. As I finalize, Mr. Speaker, the worst is our own pension in this. A pension that has a rate where you are told, this is your pension, but if you want to come in, you must pay, yet it is not profitable. We must start with our own pension, so that if members come, Mr. Speaker, they are able to pay back and just come in and
Add Honorable Beatrice Elachi 2 minutes.
Thank you.
I like the points she's making.
Yes, this one is for us in this house. Our own pension. When we were in Mombasa, we were presented with a pension and you're told it has a principal rate, an interest that you must pay. And I asked myself, Mr. Speaker, is it a profitable pension? Does it do business? So why would you pay yet it is not profitable? So the first amendment as we clear Treasury should be our own pension as we look at other pensions, and we must ensure that every pension of every Kenyan, especially in the counties, Mr. Speaker, I am telling you, Kenyans are going to suffer because of these things of pension. We have, I don't know how many pension bodies that deal with their monies. We must harmonize, have one pension, and let every Kenyan by the end of the year receive to know whether their monies are there or their monies have gone to another thing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I really support the report.
Thank you very much. Is Honorable Tomwood again in the House? The gentleman representing the people for Nyatike constituency. Not in. The Honorable Karoli Omondi, MP for Suba South constituency.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to add my voice in support of this report by the Select Committee on Public Debt and Privatization. Mr. Speaker, in a former life, not very far from here, across the road, my job was to issue what were called legal opinions on foreign loans, confirming that that loan, when added to our total national cumulative loans, would not exceed the national ceiling on debt. And we realized we were working in darkness because we could never find correct data, whether in Treasury or here. I think the history of our debt problem is much longer than we think, and I think it is time that we learn from history and the bad practices that we witnessed in the 90s, and some which I think are still prevalent up to now, and order a proper forensic audit on our foreign debt. In particular, if you remember in the old days when we had Foreign Exchange Control Act, bureaucrats and politicians were adept at creating fake debts, especially on commercial paper, for purposes of transferring foreign currency. I strongly suspect that part of the Kenyan debt is composed of fake debt, debts that actually exist just between individuals. And I think it is time this House and this committee orders for a proper forensic audit of our foreign debt, to see what is authentic and what is ineligible for purposes of being fake. Secondly, it is trite law in international commercial dealings that debts or projects tainted with corruption are not enforceable. I think you remember the case of Duty Free, where the claimant admitted before International Center for Investment Disputes that he had bribed a former head of state here. And though the termination of his contract was found to be irregular, ICSID ruled that he could not be compensated because of the tainted nature of that particular transaction. It is the same with a lot of our debt, where commercial debt is being used by bureaucrats and politicians to finance infrastructure projects other than using long-term concessional loans from multilateral agency. The SGR is a good example that which we should investigate, because there is no reason why the Kenyan SGR, which is not electric, which runs on diesel, would cost twice the SGR in Morocco, between Tangiers and Casablanca, and which was financed by the French TGV at $1.7 billion, and ours is $3.8 billion. And this is one of the reasons why I think it is now time to have an ad hoc committee of this House on state capture. Commercial debt has been one of the areas where politicians and bureaucrats have literally captured the state. And to make matters worse, our history of debt, if you drew a map of Kenya and you put pins on where the projects that have been financed by foreign debt are concentrated, you'll see the nature of our politics, how skewed it is in terms of those in power favoring certain regions. I think, Mr. Speaker, it is time to be bold and order for a forensic audit of all these debts to determine which ones are fake, which ones are tainted with corruption, and which ones simply, cannot be enforced in a court of law. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much for those informative positions. Do you have Honorable Paul Biego in the House, the MP for Jesume? Stepped out. Honorable Joshua Kimilu, MP for Kaiti, is not in the House. And the Honorable Joseph Oyola.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me this opportunity to also comment on this report by the Public Debt Committee. Mr. Speaker, this report brings out all that Parliament needs to know as far as debt position is concerned. The committee has done very well and brought out the situation of the debt as it is in Kenya today. I think more time should be given to the committee to continue unearthing some of the issues that this House has been pondering about, and particularly when it comes to the control of expenditure. Mr. Speaker, debt is not a bad thing. What is bad is how the debt is utilized. External debt should be reflected or should be seen on the ground and should be related to the development of the country. The worst part is some of this debt is used on recurrent expenditure. And that creates a bad situation as far as debt is concerned. The worst area here, Mr. Speaker, is the domestic debt. Our domestic debt is so high, and I think that's why the expenditure on debt repayment has grown very high. Something should be done to ensure that the domestic debt is controlled. The interest rates are also controlled so that we do not have banks.
Order, Honorable Joseph Oyula. Honorable Matenge, you wanted to contribute to this motion because you are somewhere very close. You are somewhere very close. If you are keen to contribute, I've noted you've been sitting for long. You'd rather sacrifice for a few more minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the domestic debt is a big burden to this nation. The interest rate is high at approximately 12 to 13%, and this encourages banks not to lend out money to private sector, but to lend the money to the government, because they are assured of earning a lot of interest from the government lending. So, Mr. Speaker, this committee has come up with a good report. This committee has come up with a good recommendation, which I think, if adopted, the House should move very fast. And particularly, there's a recommendation that Treasury should come up with the regulations on how to manage the debt expenditure. This is very important, and I suggest that the committee should follow up this to ensure that Treasury comes up with the regulations. In fact, most of the recommendations here, the committee should take these recommendations upon itself to ensure that we have an act that will enable this House to monitor the debt payment and the debt records, and particularly when we are budgeting on payment of the debt. So, Mr. Speaker, the recommendations here should be implemented. The House should adopt this report, and more research should be done to ensure that we get the exact position of the Kenyan debt and come up with the proper position of the repayment of this debt. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honorable Oyula. Honorable David Mboni, the MP for Kitui Rural.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. On onset, I want to support this report, and I want to thank the last Parliament for coming up with this committee on public debt and privatization. Mr. Speaker, this is the first report whereby Parliament, this is a first report by Parliament whereby they are looking at public debt. As earlier speaker said, debt is not a bad thing, but it becomes bad if it's not utilized for the purpose which is supposed to be utilized for. The debt which you have taken for the last 10 years, which amounts to around 8 trillion now, I think we should be seeing a lot of development in this country. Unfortunately, really we are not seeing it. And, we started wondering, myself I started wondering, where does this money go to? Is it money being used in particular areas, and other areas the debt is not used for? Mr. Speaker, in economics we say there's what we call law of diminishing returns. Now, if you use the debt, maybe probably in one area, you realize that there is no development which you are doing. I was looking at, I was a consultant in LAPSET, and the outcome was that if you develop LAPSET, you are going to increase 2% of GDP to this country, which amounts to around 250 billion every year from that investment. Mr. Speaker, there is no country which can develop without debt. In fact, most of the developed countries, they have high levels of debt. Japan has 256% of GDP as a debt. US is 133. Sudan is 210. Kenya, now this is a report which was done by World Bank in 2021. But then Kenya was at 70% of GDP. But now we are saying it has moved to 9.15% of trillion. But it's a very alarming situation. When you think about the 1.36 trillion to service the loan, the Speaker, we only collect 1.8 trillion, maybe probably 2 trillion. Now, if you remove 1.3 trillion, we are saying that we are remaining with around 600 billion to run this government, to run the country. The current expenditure alone in this country is around 600 billion. So barely we have nothing for development. So in this kind of situation, I don't think really this country can develop. Apart from the recommendations which the report is proposing, I would like to propose the following proposals, recommendations. The first thing is to reform our tax system so that we can raise more revenue. Mr. Speaker, we have been overtaxing 3 sectors of the economy: manufacturing, ICT, finance, and insurance. And we have realized that taxes from these sectors are actually going down, because these sectors, they contribute 17% of GDP, but they contribute 52% of tax revenue. So we need to expand the tax base so that we can be able to get more, go for more concessional loans, which are cheaper and which have a long repayment period. Enhance local savings, NSSF and NHIF. Let us also live within our means. But I was looking at the budget and I was wondering, I thought this supplementary budget was supposed to cut the budget by 300 billion. Unfortunately, the overall budget went up by 14 billion. You see, so I started wondering, really, as a country, where are we moving to? So we need to live within our means. We need to borrow less. We need to spend what we are raising, and really, let this country move. With those few remarks, I support.
Thank you, Honorable Mboni. The Honorable Maina Matenge, MP for Nyeri Town.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity to contribute to this debate and motion. And I rise to support the report of the committee on external debt. But even more importantly, is the appetite for our government to borrow from the local economy. Because this has the net effect of crowding out the Kenyan entrepreneur and the Kenyan companies that are meant to grow our economy, provide jobs for our people, produce goods that we can sell locally and internationally out of the financing market. And our banks have become lazy because they want to go for the money they can lend to government because it has zero risk. As a result, we find that the local banks will keep posting humongous profits while no other sector of the economy is posting any profits. These profits are directly linked to the appetite for government paper. The government must move out of the local economy in terms of borrowing to allow the Kenyan people who actually own this country and this government to thrive by allowing local banks to have sufficient liquidity to go out and become competitive in terms of the pricing of interest rates. As long as government is the single largest active player in the local debt market, the Kenyan entrepreneur, including our young people, will continue languishing in poverty. Companies in this country will continue to close as a result of failure to get financing to expand, to renovate, and to carry out improvements in line with the market trends and market demands. Mr. Speaker, debts like this SGR, like the debt for the SGR, had a negative effect in this country because it resulted in killing businesses that were thriving before the SGR came. We are borrowing and then insulating the repayment of the debt at the cost, at the expense and the cost of the local economy. This is not sustainable. And therefore, the presence of this House and the say of this House in determining when, where, and for what purpose the government must borrow is long overdue. And therefore, I support this committee for the positive step that they are taking. And I'm urging us as a House to be even more bold, to want to have a say in determining what can be borrowed by our government and what cannot be borrowed. That is my submission. I support.
Thank you very much for that informative submission. Honorable Abdikadir Mohamed, the MP for Lagdera, is in the House. Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me this opportunity to contribute to this very important debate on consolidated fund service expenditures. Mr. Speaker, 68% of the consolidated fund is used to offset debts. We only remain with 2% from our consolidated fund to fund all other activities. This country is supposed to borrow about 838 billion this year. Our development expenditure is about 610 billion. It means that we are using loans to develop. Again, maybe over 230 billion again to finance our current expenditure or repaying loans. It's like we are taking loans to pay another loan. And I'm saying this, if we continue doing this, if we don't improve our revenue, or if we don't increase our productivity as a country, we'll go the Ghana way, which defaulted paying the sovereign debts. And that will be too bad for our economy. Mr. Speaker, bureaucrats or government officers, when they're borrowing loans, they don't look into conditions. They just borrow loans, sign. And then when we take that loan, the people who are paying those loans give such conditions so hard that sometimes even implement the project will be a problem. An example, we have a program, we have a project in my constituency and other parts of Garissa County. The project is called Kenya Development Response to Development Impacts Project, Dr. This project is being financed by World Bank. And now it's continued for 5 years. But the problem is that World Bank wants to micromanage these projects. Every small misunderstanding, they want the bank to intervene. They threaten to cancel the projects. And this is money that has been given to us as a loan. It's not their money. Why do they want to micromanage a project in Lagdera constituency? Why do they have to threaten us canceling the loan, which they've already given us, when there's a very small misunderstanding or somebody writes something which could be lie about the project? So I urge the government, whenever we're taking loan, we must look at the conditions attached. Because some of these conditions are so punitive that implement the project will be a problem. Because World Bank, an example, the one I'm talking about, the World Bank loan given to us want to micromanage the project that we are doing. It's very much want to micromanage the staffing, the subordinate staff. They won't have a say, and this is a loan. So let us look at the conditions of the loans when we are borrowing. The country has a very high appetite for loan, because if we don't take loan, we want to develop. If we don't borrow, we won't be able to pay our debts. But as it is now, we're almost using 230 billion loans, worth of loans, to pay even some of our recurrent expenditure. Some that we can avoid. So we have options either to increase our revenues or to increase our productivity, or maybe wait for divine interventions. Because as it is now, maybe in the next 2-3 years, as we borrow more, we fail to pay our loans because we are not increasing revenues, and then we go the gun away, and then it will be bad for us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. The Honorable Mboko Milemba, MP for Emuhaya, Assistant Speaker.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker, and thank you, the Chair of this committee, for this particular report. That Article 206 established the consolidated fund in this country, where all monies that are supposed to be in government go to, was correct. And then it also went further to create the consolidated fund services. This is the monies that will actually come from the pool where the monies for government have gone to, apart from those that may be determined not to go there by this particular parliament. Now, in that consolidated fund and consolidated fund services, the highest expenditure from that particular fund is actually foreign debt. And that is why foreign debt then becomes a very important topic, as this report has indicated. And further, that this expenditure on foreign debt has increased, has sprung up between 2017-2018 to the present day by more than 105%. Those are the facts in this particular report. That now we are spending so much on payment of debt, and it has increased within 5 years by about 105%. So that's why foreign debt then becomes a very important topic, because it means of all the funds from the consolidated fund, almost over 100% of it is being spent on foreign debt. Yet we are continuing to borrow. This is what this report brings to bear. Therefore, it becomes very important that we control foreign debt so that we control the expenditure from CFS to pay the foreign debt. Also, something that comes out very clearly here is the fact that from the first charge of the CFS are not only the foreign debt. In fact, there has been a misguidance in this country, Honorable Speaker. I come from the labor movement, and sometimes you are told that the government is spending too much money on recurrent expenditure. So then we, the workers of this country, get worried that maybe a lot of salaries are being paid. I want to put it to you, Honorable Speaker, that in fact the payment on salaries has been reducing since 2017. In fact, it has reduced by about 13%. So when you talk about recurrent expenditure, it's not the salaries as the normal Kenyan will take it. Payment on salaries are reducing. But what is really increasing and making recurrent expenditure increase is the payment of foreign debt. Unfortunately, the payment of salaries for workers in this country has been lumped together with the payment of foreign debt. So when it increases, people imagine that the salaries are the ones that are increasing. And this is why this report is here, and this country must know, so that we bring this to an end. That this country doesn't even know how much it has borrowed. Very interesting. There are agencies in this country which are supposed to be told how much we have borrowed. And one of such a unit is the Controller and Auditor General, who submitted that he doesn't know how much we have borrowed because it doesn't have the correct or all the disclosure on how much we have borrowed. There are levels when he reaches, that office reaches, no disclosure is given. And that is the area where we borrow through what is called guarantees. There are organizations in these countries like KQ and others which can just go and borrow and then the government guarantee. But the government itself and government officials, and that's why this report should indict some government officers who are not giving complete disclosure of the guarantees of government. And I think I picked the points from the Honorable Suba. He seemed to have been exact on this, that some of the debts we are talking about could be personal debts, because if they are not personal, why are the authorities not disclosing every debt? And that is why 3 levels of foreign debt are given by different agencies in this particular country. So we even don't know how much we have borrowed. And that's what the report is talking about. That soon you will be told, and it's coming to this parliament, that now we must change the way we are borrowing. Yes, we have borrowed up, we have given a ceiling of 10 trillion. You remember how we argued over that. But this report says that when you put everything together and even include the pending bills which have been talked about, we have surpassed 10 trillion. Yet they will bring a document here.
Add Honorable Mboko Mlemba 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. Which will require, Kenya should listen to this, that now we borrow as per the percentile of GDP. And I've had a honorable member speak on it there. But I would wish to say this about borrowing as a percentile of GDP. Yes, it's good. Countries who have done that equally have lent their money outside, and that money is earning profit. Kenya has not done any one of that. So when you boast of Japan having borrowed a very high percentage of its GDP, sometimes it borrows to also lend to African countries which are paying at a high profit. Hey, are you listening to me? So we cannot just go their way because we have to go their way. We have to look at our situation individually, because we have not lent any money anywhere. Even to small countries around us, like Sudan, we have not lent any money and we are not getting any profits. And that is why this foreign debt really must be checked. Too much to say about this, but what I want to say is that let's support the report and let's give this committee the teeth to bite, so that before finally we do the final budget, we also have discussed the status of foreign debt and how much we can borrow. Soon they will tell us that we surrender the borrowing to them. Please don't accept that. Thank you, Honorable Speaker.
You know, the best brain on matters finance from Homa Bay County is Honorable Andrew Kwame Adipo. Give him a chance to contribute and also to tell us how much foreign debt has been used to fund what project in Homa Bay County.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't know whether I'm able to tell you that, because do you have any anyway? So if I doubt what I'm asking, it is impossible for me to say a word on how much of the foreign debt has gone to development in my area. That is Homa Bay County. Mr. Speaker, we have a serious problem. Our debt is rising. And a situation where the cost of living is extremely high, the cost of business is very high. Many businesses are migrating from Kenya, going to other countries. Some are closing down. Just behind us here, Intercontinental Hotel is no more. At one time they said another hotel was soon closing. All these are happening in Kenya, and that means that our revenue collection must go down, because the bodies which produce revenue for us are going away. Now, we need to find out why we need to borrow, even to feed ourselves, because the recurrent expenditure is not what we should borrow for. We are actually borrowing more for expenditure now than what we borrow for development. Development projects would help us. They would help the economy. So that is one area where we need to begin. Let me say that public debt, which is comprised of local or domestic borrowing and foreign borrowing. Let me say foreign borrowing, though it is better because it is cheaper, but since we borrow in foreign currency, the rate at which we'll be paying is increasing depending on the behavior of our Kenya shillings in the market. So I don't know which one you would say is better. Local one also has disadvantages of denying our local people money to do business because the government is competing them. And the government borrowing is attractive to banks more than the individual borrowing. So if we keep ourselves in borrowing in local currency or local market, certainly the local businesses will suffer. So there we have to do something. But one thing which have been said before by my colleagues is that we really need to know what this total debt accumulated is composed of. We need a breakdown per country or per company so that we can analyze and know the correctness, the genuineness of this foreign currency. Mr. Speaker, we also need to do the same with local.
Kupata mtumaini Mungu kama sikiza tune yako, bonyeza *811 *815#.
Mtumaini Mwenyezi Mungu kwa moyo wako wote, wala usitegemee akili zako mwenyewe. Umtambue Mungu katika kila